Warning: the following review may contain images and discussions centered around mature and graphic topics not suitable for a younger audience. This also applies to the sensitive and the squeamish. Viewer discretion is advised. Poor characterization, weak narration from the pun overtaking the fine no relation to the pointless plot. Description is so apparent, the Romans held some in the 1,000-yard stare. Book is thick, but nothing will stick. Gotta take my chances, well, that flick. But the worst of all, the reason I weak didn't get far on the 8-page theme.
Where can I find this
The bookstore's closed, the cafe's packed, nothing left to do but sing a little rap.
Well, now I'll just keep
Scan the book, pop in the DVD, and take some time, come read with me.
How's it going, bookworms, filmsters? My name is Mike, and I am super excited to welcome y'all to the channel's first ever BV TV review. Yes, sir, after years of doing book to movie comparisons, it's about time I try my hands at talking about some well-known TV series that have originated from literary sources. Honestly, I was hesitant for the longest time about doing this because of the immense workload, but from what I learned and experienced with this project, I think it's manageable as long as the series itself is something I am willing to dedicate my time and energy to. Originally, I wanted to cover the new Percy Jackson show that came out recently, but feared that I missed my window of opportunity, and truly believed that it wouldn't have performed as well if it was uploaded months after its release. Rest assured though, it will be made. Now I'm just waiting for the right time for it. In the meantime, I went down the list to the next series I've had my eyes on reviewing for a while now, The Boys. I became an immediate fan back when it first aired in 2019 and have always looked forward to each upcoming season. Also, with the unfortunate news of Chance Perdomo's death earlier this year, it made me more motivated to spread the word of this series so people could check it out if they haven't, along with its spin-off series, Gen V. You can find this show on Amazon, the same streaming platform as Invincible, another popular superhero show. But between the two, The Boys just caught my eyes a little more because it really doesn't follow that traditional route you often expect from the genre. The way it subverts our expectations at a consistent rate is phenomenal, especially with its first season. Personally, it is one of the best television shows I have seen in recent years, and I still stand by it, now more than ever as it enters its 4th season. But sticking with the series since the start, I'm always reminded how much more superior the show is over the original comics. That was something I could never really agree nor deny because I'm not an avid comic book reader and never had the time to really sit down and see if this was true or not. Until today. Can't tell you how happy I was to have finally sat down and spent weeks reading and educating myself with one of my favorite series. Also, I can answer the question if this comic was really as bad as everyone says. That's what we're going to find out today. So without further ado, allow me to give you the rundown on this dark and edgy series known as The Boys. The Boys was created in 2006 by Irish-American comic writer Garth Ennis. He's been with the industry for most of his career, better known for taking on characters and storylines that share a similar violent and chaotic nature. He's had his hand with characters like Judge Dredd, Hellblazer, and The Punisher, but when it comes to original creations, he's often remembered for 2 series, The Preacher and The Boys. Growing up around British comics, he wasn't exposed to American-made heroes and really doesn't find them all that interesting. To him, those heroes were presented more as immortal figures who couldn't be harmed, and so perfect that their legacies remain timeless. In his own words, these heroes were personified brands that could live on for eternity, churning out an infinite amount of issues with minimal effort and narrative power. The face alone will be enough to generate a profit. With Ennis's time in the industry, he saw firsthand how these heroes would get top priority and special treatment over the more narrative comics with amazing depth but definitive endings to their stories. So in a way, The Boys was Ennis's way to visually express what he saw. And despite how awful and deranged he gets when writing these heroes, it's not a personal attack. He doesn't have any problems with heroes, at best he just thinks they're stupid. It's more about how the comic industry and how they place them on such a holy pedestal that they are incapable of being touched or brought down to a lower level. And I don't doubt that he's the first one to challenge this notion. I haven't read or seen a lot of material that deconstructs heroes, but I know they're out there. But this is the first one where I could just feel some kind of personal vendetta from the writing alone. It's that obvious and screams at your face. Almost all the heroes have some kind of disturbing problem, with the most powerful ones being the most despicable. I'm talking real egotistical scumbags, the kind of self-entitled assholes you could run into in your day-to-day, except they got the strength to crush your skull in or toss you 15,000 feet from the air. And not just them, but the corporation that profits off them too. Ennis has a real fascination with war history, which is sprinkled all throughout this series. One of his main inspirations was James Ellroy, who wrote tightly structured novels that unraveled American history by exploring shadow groups like the CIA or the Mafia, and how corrupt politicians and organizations worked to form the world we recognize today. He wanted this series to reflect that, but by adding superheroes into the mix. How would our reality work if they did exist and were more involved in our culture and lifestyle? How would it turn out for them to be raised by corporate greed, treated more like products than natural people, and elevated to a celebrity status that couldn't be touched or fought by the average Joe? That's essentially what The Boys is. A world where the ideal image of heroes is merely a mask for who they really are at their core. A world where one evil corporation is using them for their own personal gain, and the only ones who could stop them is a CIA group who will do whatever it takes to keep those soups in line. And believe me, they will do just about anything. Things that were not okay with DC, mainly because the series took major jabs at some of their more titular properties, and they didn't want that image ruined from within their own house. What Ennis did was pretty much the equivalent of taking a dump in the small corner of his boss's lawn. He published the first 6 issues at Wildstorm Productions, which wasn't that big of an imprint, but still connected to DC, and after they read the material, the company returned all the rights to his creator and told him to look elsewhere. Ennis would later go on to say that this was probably the best decision. Had he decided to stay, his project would have most likely been neutered and restricted to the point where it stopped resembling the vision he originally had. Lucky for him though, it was not that hard to find a new home. While DC wasn't willing to take on this satirical take on the world's most popular heroes, other publishers saw the potential and showed immense interest until Ennis finally decided to partner up with Dynamite Entertainment, which was known for publishing comic adaptations of licensed films and literary properties, so Terminator, Zorro, Dracula, and various stories of the like. For Ennis, this company wasn't that big, so he didn't have to worry about his story getting lost or buried under the wide range of content. It wasn't that small either, so he had faith that the company wouldn't go under. But what he loved the most though was the creative liberty to be as violent and gruesome and chaotic and whatever else he needed this story to be. Thanks to this partnership, The Boys had a strong 6-year run, being completed on November 2012 with 72 issues, 3 limited spin-off series that further expanded the story and its characters, and an epilogue in 2020. This commercial success would then lead to offers for a potential adaptation. At one point, there was talk of turning the series into a movie, first picked up by Columbia Pictures until they dropped the idea, and then by Paramount, but that never went anywhere. As a TV series though, Cinemax greenlit the idea, but it was eventually Amazon Studios who made something out of it. Eric Kripke, the creator of Supernatural, was going to produce a show alongside Evan Goldberg and Seth Rogen. And if you're familiar with their work, it was safe to say this project finally landed in the right hands. Not just in the right hands, but coincidentally at the right time too. By the time Amazon picked up the series, the superhero genre was at the peak of its popularity thanks to the MCU's Infinity War saga. Viewers were already in a familiar headspace to understand certain tropes, customs, and icons that would be suitable for the series' satirical take on today's cinematic heroes. I don't think the average comic book reader would have any problems understanding the references and heroes the comic series would occasionally poke fun at, but I think they would have gone over most people's heads had it have been a direct adaptation. But by blending that world with our current view of pop culture and media consumption and giving these heroes the same likeness as modern day celebrities, the show will provide a similar yet fresh experience with the story. In some way, the TV series had a similar history like the comics, in which it just needed the right team, the right production studio, and that all worked out by its premiere on July 26, 2019. While not as violent and unhinged as its comic book counterpart, the show still presented itself with that dark and twisted tone from this universe, making some viewers squeamish while others regarded it as one of the best live-action superhero shows out there. I am one of those people super excited to talk about today and just go over the many differences between the comic and show, but just to be fair, I feel like I have to say this one more time. If you're new to this channel, I explore a wide range of literature from the most light-hearted narratives to the more serious and mature themes. Being considerate to my audience of all ages, I have to be clear. This is not for the faint-hearted. This series is not afraid to cross boundaries on any level and will most likely say or do something to make you scream, gag, or extremely pissed off. While I don't plan on showing anything extreme or graphic in this review, I can't guarantee that our eyes and ears won't get sullied the whole way through, especially when I have to explain certain events from the comics. So be aware that this review may contain adult content, graphic language, graphic violence, nudity, sex, super sex, blackmail sex, death by sex, sexual assault, sexual harassment, drugs, drug abuse, animal cruelty, illegal clan fishing, religious bashing, 9/11, fetus monsters, face mask removals, self-shaming, group shaming, corporate shaming, peeping toms, invisible peeping toms, Seth Rogen, and literally anything else you can think of that's not safe for work. This is your last chance to turn back now. Otherwise, you've been warned. Anyways, I think I talked your ears off long enough. So please, sit back, relax, maintain pure thoughts as we get our hands dirty and see how much trouble we can cause with Season 1's The Boys. The first sequence of events we get from the pilot episode is fantastic by how it introduces us to this world. These two nerds get caught up in the middle of a robbery but are soon saved by the city's very best, Queen Maeve and the Homelander. They are part of this superhero group known as the Seven, which is the series' take on the Justice League. They are very strong and very ruthless, establishing the level of violence and how their enemies will be incarcerated with more than a couple of bruises. A news reporter arrives on the scene to film the aftermath, and the footage transitions out into an electronics store where our protagonist, Hughie Campbell, works at. Right off the bat, we come across our first major difference, that being Hughie himself. In the comics, he is of Scottish descent, and if you look closely enough, you could kinda see a resemblance to Simon Pegg. This is no coincidence either. At the very start, Ennis intended to base Hughie's character design after the actor. And since this was written around the mid-2000s, think back to how he looked around the Shaun of the Dead era. After the series' success and talks for a movie adaptation, Simon Pegg would have played the role of Hughie, but because of all the delays and false hope, he became too old for the role by the time Amazon picked up the series. But just old enough to play Hughie's dad, and having him say Jinx at least once.
Jinx.
But even if Hughie doesn't have that Scottish blood in him, his wimpy and passive nature is still strong. Hughie is essentially the innocent scapegoat who gets hit with the reality of this universe on multiple occasions. Being raised in the more sheltered and comforting lifestyle, he's not known for his assertiveness, such as this scene where he struggles to ask for a raise and his girlfriend Robin teasing him about it. Yet, it's an easy life, but that doesn't stay that way for long. Just as they're plotting the next stage in their relationship, Hughie's entire world explodes in the fraction of a microsecond as his girlfriend has been run over by the A-Train.
I can't stop.
Her death was inevitable in both the show and comics since it's the major inciting change that sparks Huey's journey. But there are some differences, and not just in the way she dies, but where it initially happened. Even though the main story primarily takes place in New York, the comic took liberties in expanding the influence of Supes outside US borders. In hindsight, the story revolved around different parts of the world coming together to prevent the evil spawning from this US corporation. And aside from a few locations, no one outside the US really knew the existence of these heroes. Huey for sure didn't. He was just having an ordinary day in Scotland with his girl, deeply in love and talking about a conspiracy theory until interrupted by the A-Train, who was fighting the villain across international waters and tossed the assailant against a brick wall, where Robin caught in between. In that scene, it really was an accident, but for the direction this season is going, it puts all the blame on the fastest man alive, who flees in a panic, leaving Huey to slowly comprehend the situation. It isn't long until he and his dad are returning from the funeral service, shifting from grief to anger real quick as the news captures A-Train and the company he's tied to, Vought, making a public apology and twisting the narrative, saying Robin was standing in the middle of the street.
She was a half step off the curb. Now, come on.
Not long after, some suit from Vought comes by to try and get Huey to sign this confidentiality agreement with a $45,000 payout, just as long as he agreed to never speak about the tragic incident ever again. Now this was not uncommon practice. The comic showed more instances of this persuasion tactic, giving the grave impression of the company always having the cover for the many accidents and tragedies caused by their business. But with all the money and Supes on their side, you can imagine how hard it'd be to just say no. Huey wishes he could just express his frustrations and tell him to f*** off, but being so soft and afraid to take that chance, the best he could say is,
Can I think about it?
After the suit leaves, Huey begins to plan out his next big brain idea to settle this in court. But Simon Pegg shuts him down quickly, saying how he doesn't have the guts or nerve to follow this through, leading Huey to walk out, which doesn't work out for him either. It's not until later where we learn how much of a fan Huey was to these heroes, especially the A-Train.
Special 2016 Comic-Con edition? What, they make like a few hundred of these?
So the fact that his girlfriend died at the hands of someone he idolized left him with such a traumatic response that he couldn't function with the mere sight of him. He basically suffered a panic attack from just trying to grab a drink at the convenience store. It seems like Huey would never recover from this tragic loss, but at the dead of night comes his one chance of payback in the form of Billy Butcher. Billy Butcher is the leader of the Boys, a subdivision CIA group that keeps a close watch over the Supes and intervenes when their crimes go unpunished. In the comics, he had tight connections that would provide them info on heinous Supe cases that were swept under the rug, and he took a particular interest in Huey's case, more so because he didn't accept a payout right away. Aside from the difference of this conversation happening in Glasgow, it still remains faithful by Butcher's intentions to open Huey's eyes to the superficial reality, what Supes are really like behind the fame and sponsorships, and offers a real chance to get vengeance for Robin's death. After taking him to a secret Supes club and showing the footage of A-Train laughing about the incident with another Supe, Butcher tries to talk Huey into accepting the confidentiality deal, with the condition of A-Train being there in person to apologize. Doing so will allow Huey to enter Vaught's corporate tower and, by Butcher's instructions, plant bugs to listen in on the Seven. This was another difference from the comics because by the time Huey joined with the Boys, those bugs were already in place. As for who did it and why, those details could be explained at a different time. For now, all you need to know is that they were there from the start. However, in the show, things are just getting started, and it seems way too much for Huey to handle, so he declines the offer and just tries to move on with his life, until he shares a park bench with one Annie January. Up until now, we have just gotten the perspective of a super fan being hit with reality, but let's hop onto the other side of the spectrum and see the inner workings of Vaught's operations through the eyes of a super girl. Our guide through this side of the story mainly revolves around Annie January, or if you prefer her superhero name, Starlight. Born in Des Moines, Iowa, she's had a pretty innocent upbringing and spent a lot of her youth developing her powers, competing in soup pageants, and fighting crime around her hometown. Like Huey, she starts out with a narrow view of the world, maintaining her sense of justice and altruistic desire to build a better place. But that all changes when she nails the application process and is granted a position to be in the Seven. This decision was made to fill the position of another member of the Seven known as Lamplighter, whose retirement was announced at the company's shareholder meeting hosted by the Vice President of Hero Management, Madison Stillwell. And her role in the show is interesting because technically, she makes up half a character. She and another character we'll meet later on make up the full complexity of James Stillwell, a dedicated Vought executive who will do whatever means necessary to uphold all of Vaught's goals and values. Madison never goes to extreme lengths to get results like the comic Stillwell, but she knows how to play the game and wouldn't hesitate to blackmail a politician if she needs to. She's also the one primarily in charge of watching over the Seven, and with the help of the company's Director of Talent Relations, Ashley Barrett, they direct the Supes on how to perform and act for the company. However, they can't be on them 24/7, which sucks for Annie and her first night at the Vought Tower, which is another change from the comics. Mocking the early designs of the Justice League headquarters, the Seven had their base in space, creating a divisive line between them and the mortals. Yet the show made a smart change, not only with the decision to keep them all grouped up and save on production costs, but also speaking loudly on Vaught's immense control over them. Annie is given this small tour by the Deep, who, in my opinion, had the best change from the comics. You'll hear me say this a lot, but I just can't get over how the show massively improved on some of these supporting characters who never really had a chance to flourish. He was practically forgettable in the comics, not by design, but by how often he remained in the background. He had his moments, surprisingly headstrong and at times the voice of reason, but compared to the rest of the Seven, he never had any memorable involvement with the boys or the main story. The same could be said with the show's depiction of the Deep, especially towards the latter half of the season, but through Chance Crawford's amazing performance, this Soup's overflowing charisma and pretty boy status plays a contributing role for Vought. He's the ideal poster boy that magnetizes the spotlight through commercials, announcements, and attractions. Even Annie couldn't resist his charm.
I kind of had a schoolgirl crush on you. Oh my god.
However, as you'll see with most Vought-sponsored Supes, he's got his problems too, such as misinterpreting this situation and dropping his pants almost immediately, expecting Annie to give him a quick blowy if she wanted to keep her position on the team. This scene in the comics was much more horrifying, and the Deep wasn't even a part of it. Initially, it was Homelander who was giving the tour, and after making this exact proposition, the A-Train and mysterious Black Noir joined in to put Annie at a 3-to-1 disadvantage. One change I love from the show over the comics is the respect it has for the woman in this series. If they're not a main or supporting character, most of the women shown are pretty one-dimensional and only serve the purpose of getting abused or getting used in some derogatory fashion. Heck, it even takes a while for Annie to show some backbone, so I really appreciate the show for bringing that assertive side of her much quicker, as shown here. But because she shined her light powers a little too brightly, it caused damage within the official briefing room, and the Deep took advantage of her and threatened to twist the narrative, giving her no choice but to comply. While not completely wrecked like in the comics, she still comes out of the restroom feeling pretty low, and is told by Queen Maeve to
never let them see you like this.
Hell of a lot nicer than Queen Maeve from the comics, who flat out told her to f*** off. So far, not the best first impression with the Seven, and what makes this experience worse is that she's all alone in the big city. She's got her mom, but she cares too much about the fame than her daughter's problems, so Annie feels conflicted to just sit with them, right across from the guy who's also going through a rough time. By this point in the comics, Huey has already moved to New York and started working with the boys, but one incident that happened without his consent made him reconsider this path, and he tried to take his mind off things by walking through Central Park, where he meets Annie for the first time. The conversation is more or less the same, with them venting about their current situations, but the show does a little more work to demonstrate their compatibility with one another. Each one provides the other with encouraging words to keep going after the first stumble, and to remain strong and fight when the going gets tough. Because of this, Annie feels a lot more confident in herself and makes it clear that she ain't going anywhere. As for Huey, he goes along with Butcher's plan and schedules a meeting with Vought to infiltrate the tower and plant a bug in the Seven's briefing room. This was a very tense operation, especially for a weak man like Huey, but even when faced against his girlfriend's killer, he manages to maintain his composure, sign the papers, and quietly set the bug. Mission accomplished, right? Well, one thing to understand about Huey is that, whether by his own actions or the hands of the universe, things can never go that smoothly for him. In this case, it was a little of both. While trying to take out the bug from his phone, his butterfingers dropped the device and let it fall out of the bathroom stall. For that, a little blame on his part for being clumsy. But I won't blame him for accidentally entering the girl's bathroom, because the building really should have a sign for that. And there was no way he could have ever guessed that this bathroom had its own super pervert watching the entire fumble.
What the
This is Translucent, the Invisible Man for the Seven. He's an original character from the show, never once shown or mentioned in the comics. His position in the Seven originally belonged to this parody of Martian Manhunter known as Jack from Jupiter. While they are two completely different characters, Translucent does adopt Jack's indestructible skin, with the additional ability to bend light and turn himself invisible at will. But with that kind of power, he gravitates towards deviant behavior and does what every horny guy with this kind of power would realistically do: peep in places where they don't belong. Unfortunately for Huey, he was at the wrong place at the wrong time, and once Butcher drops him off in time for his graveyard shift, Translucent follows him back to work and gets violent, wanting to know more about the bug. Huey almost dies until Butcher rams Translucent with his car and gets into a bloody brawl, using his own blood to outline the Invisible Man and make it a fair fight. This is our first real glimpse of how the boys operate, and how Huey's intellect and tech knowledge could be a major asset to the group. Thanks to an early episode of Jimmy Fallon, Huey learns about Translucent's carbon metamaterial skin and electrocutes the man, leaving the winners with an unconscious soup in their hands. It's a somewhat victorious moment, but they can't expect the same result for every soup they come across. Some are just too large and unmanageable, like Homelander. Throughout this whole episode, we see Madison trying to set the mayor of Baltimore with one of Vought's soups for $300 million a year. However, the mayor tries to compromise with blackmail, demonstrating his knowledge of Compound V, a secret that will be explored throughout this season. Even though Madison denies knowing anything about it, she eventually decides to settle with $230 million. However, when the mayor and his son are flying back to Baltimore, Homelander makes a surprise visit, much to the kids' enjoyment, but complete terror for the mayor. In the world of the boys, safety is not guaranteed, and this first episode proved that fact on a substantial level. Sometimes to get the results you want, you're gonna have to play dirty, stand your ground, and do whatever it takes to be on top. It's a twisted world, but hey, that's just the name of the game. Episode 2 has a heavy focus on the Invisible Man, who ironically has gone missing. Thanks to these two. Huey and Butcher throw Translucent in the trunk and escape the crime scene before the cops arrive. A bump in the trunk indicates that the soup is alive, much to Huey's relief, but it's still a problem since Translucent has already seen their faces and needs to be dealt with. Lucky for them though, Butcher has his connections and drives him to meet with the next member. By this point in the season, it becomes clear that the boys are starting from scratch, which wasn't the case in the comics. All members of the boys were already intact, and Butcher had the backing of the police and government, but here, Butcher doesn't have anything, not even official clearance.
Technically, I'm not a Fed.
What?
Because of an incident I won't be exploring this season, it practically split the boys apart and dissolved the project altogether. The only one trying to keep it going is Butcher, who carries such a personal vendetta against Soups that he won't stop until he finds his chance to retaliate. And Huey's case led him to such a golden opportunity that he had enough reason to bring the band back together. The first guy he goes to is Frenchie. Along with another member, he's the muscle of the group, and definitely the most friendliest. When he's not at work, he's pretty laid back and releases good vibes at any given point. But he can also channel his inner demon when the job demands it, and be as brutal as anyone else in the group. The show made him more like a jack of all trades kind of character with multiple skill sets in a lot of areas. Here, he's primarily introduced as an arms dealer, who apparently is owed $40,000 from Butcher, but instead of money, he's delivered more problems.
You bring this to my doorstep. This is not my problem, huh?
It sure is now, thanks to Butcher showing Frenchie's face to the soup and not being aware that Vought has him chipped, so they could track him at any moment. Because of this, the Frenchman is forced to tag along and provide them a hideout in an abandoned restaurant. As Huey is layering the ceiling with some shielding foil to block out the chip signal, the other boys are trying to figure out how to penetrate the Invisible Man's skin and kill him before Vought starts to really question his disappearance, which does cause some problems. He was supposed to appear for this cancer kid's Make-A-Wish request, but on the account of him being caged up, that responsibility was demoted to A-Train, who couldn't have handled the situation any more poorly, as you can see by the immediate shift in angered and saddened emojis.
Teach you to run as fast as me.
Yeah? You'll teach me to outrun cancer?
Translucent was also expected to do some patrol work with the Deep, but that responsibility now falls on Annie, who, as you can imagine, isn't all that thrilled about this partnership. However, she's given the chance to make her boundaries loud and clear before going into some real crime-fighting work. And by real, I mean completely fake and staged. The previous episode also provided a low-key implication that the bank robbery heist at the beginning was also fake, since the police logs that Butcher gives Huey had no evidence of that incident ever happening. In the comics, before even joining the Seven, Annie was already used to this kind of tactic when she was working for Vought's team division, the Young Americans. Through Vought's control and direction, the young Soups knew who they were supposed to save, how to save them, and were instructed to perform in a way that would attract the most attention. In the show though, it seems like this kind of publicity was only reserved for the big leagues, as we have seen Annie doing her own work with a basic police scanner. But now that she's running with the Seven, she doesn't have to worry about doing her own homework, since Vought has its own crime analytics team to scout the globe for crime. But this was not the sort of crime fighting she was expecting.
Stand over him and say this is lit.
After work, she takes a walk and finds two guys that are about to sexually assault this woman until she steps in to stop it from happening. This was a lot more rewarding than what Vought planned for her, but because the incident was caught on camera, it got uploaded on YouTube, putting Annie in trouble for revealing her secret identity and not getting the name of the victim. So it just looks like her beating on two dudes for no reason.
Oh, yeah. Oh.
Because of this, she's set up for a lot of meetings, including one with Madison, but that wouldn't be resolved in this episode, as she's got her hands full with trying to win over senator votes and have Soups put in the military. Throughout the comics, this has been Vought's main goal, ever since the early days when they were providing weapons and equipment for US troops. I really have to compliment Ennis on this, because witnessing the history of Vought's progression into the power they hold today was quite the experience. One thing to know about Vought is that they suck at making quality products. Two of their most acknowledged failures were warplanes and rifles that would implode on themselves and kill anyone with the desire to use them. They were notorious for cutting corners with their products and only wanted to make things for national defense because that's where the real money was. Yet, with poor results in safety and maintenance, the company would cut their losses, disappear from the public eye, and re-emerge under a new name and product that's just waiting to be sold. And the Soups were their next money-making scheme. Vought got their hands on superheroes with the intention of reaching that one ultimate goal they've had since the beginning, trying to make a profit through the military. The specifics of this pursuit will be dissected as we go along, but just know that this is Madison's entire goal for this season. And she'd do anything to get her votes. I mean, in just this episode alone, she went as far as to blackmail one senator by leading him on with one of her Soups known as the Doppelganger, who can shape his voice and appearance at will.
You shiver when you orgasm, sir.
Oh, Jesus.
It's moments like these that earned her the name Stillwell, along with finding ways to keep Homelander in line. Because of what the Deep found from the mayor's plane crash, the details point back to Homelander, who did this on his own accord. This becomes the start of Homelander's arc as he's finding ways to please Madison and Vaughn, which doesn't stray far from how it was in the comics. Wanting to be more than an icon and figurehead, he believes he can do more for the company and be an asset to her mission. Yet, in both comic and show, as the story progressed, so did the relationship between Homelander and Stillwell. From what started out as trying to be a company man, this weird dynamic begins to form, seeming as if Homelander is doing these things to either impress or receive specific attention from Stillwell. And the show made it even weirder by giving us a female version of Stillwell. If Stillwell in the comics was perceived to be some sort of father figure to Homelander, you can imagine how insane it was to pair him with a mommy figure, and you'll see just what I mean later on. For now though, Homelander feels like he could do more, and proposes to look for Translucent personally. Madison tells him not to worry about it, but after enough waiting, he does it anyways, and finds the Invisible Man's location thanks to the boys' reckless attempts to kill him. Frenchie tried making bullets from the same material as his skin, but all that did was ricochet a round through the foil and give away their position. He also tried chainsawing the man, but that was also a bust. Eventually, he finds the solution after glancing at a documentary on turtles, realizing that creatures with tough skin would only be destroyed from the inside. So he shocks the caged man unconscious again, and when he wakes back up, he realizes just what they've done to him.
S-bomb.
Translucent is scared now, spilling all the limited info he knows about A-Train, but that isn't gonna stop Butcher from triggering the explosives. What will though, is the arrival of Homelander now in the area, and with his super hearing, he's gonna hear the detonation in the heartbeat. The boys undergo the most dangerous 3 minutes of their lives as they have to stall the soup while setting up a different explosion at one of Frenchie's other hideouts. Right as Homelander starts to get suspicious, the bomb is set off and captures the soup's attention. Meanwhile, Huey is left to deal with Translucent, who escaped his cage thanks to this empty glass of water Huey gave him earlier in the episode as a means to be reasonable and try interrogating him on his own. This whole episode, Huey's been struggling with the idea of this soup having to die. He's had a talk with his dad to remind him of his softness, a conversation with Frenchie and some of the kills he couldn't forget. He even tried to bargain a deal with Translucent, but that backfired and made him feel more inferior than he already believed to be. The accumulation of all these things were swirling in his head, looking for the right answer, but what really set him off was this sanitary poster to keep your hands clean. And I guess for him to see that, the rule just wasn't working for him anymore. So this scene has two significant differences between the killer and the killee. In the comics, Huey's first kill was not someone from the Seven, but from this adolescent super team known as Teenage Kicks. This is the first real set of antagonists for the boys in the comics, and pretty much for this whole first season. It's not a complete copy of the Teenage Kicks arcs, but certain soups and story elements are picked and touched upon as the season progresses. The title of the episode, Cherry, is in reference to issues 3 through 6 that revolve around Huey's first experience with the boys, including his first official kill against his soup known as the Blarney Cock. In a way, you can say he popped his cherry with this thrill of choosing violence. The other difference revolves around Translucent, or rather Jack from Jupiter. He does become the first of the Seven upon Huey's arrival to be killed off, but it was originally from Butcher's hands in retaliation for killing someone near and dear to his cold, murderous heart. As for how, let's just say that Translucent got off pretty quick and easy. The same can't be said for Huey though. With the remains of a soup splattered all over the room, it can only go downhill from here. In episode 3, the Teenage Kick arc really begins to take off as we are focusing on two of its former members, Popclaw and A-Train, along with some of their bad habits. But before all that, the boys have to wipe away the remains of their last job. Butcher takes care of the cleanup while Huey's escorted by Frenchie to gather some clothes from his house and destroy the image of himself as a dedicated fanboy. His destruction is so loud that it catches his dad's attention, who tries talking his son into staying, but that makes Huey's anger erupt even more. This relationship is fairly accurate to how his parents treated him in the comics, always coddling, always treating him like a baby, loving him too much to a nauseating degree. That was pretty much the treatment he got everywhere he went, even from his friends. But now, spending just a day or two with Butcher and doing something that felt remotely new or exciting, he wanted to keep chasing that feeling, not hesitating to let anyone bring him back to that old life. So as much as Simon Pegg tries to reason with his son, Huey just isn't listening anymore and goes into this emotional rant saying how much he hated their simple way of living, right down to the pizza rolls.
Now, you love pizza rolls.
When I was 7!
Funny enough, this isn't the only member of the boys who talks with a parent this episode. After Butcher finished up his business with Translucent, he tracks down the next member of the boys, MM, short for Marvin T. Milk, but goes by his nickname Mother's Milk. In the comics, his real name is Baron Wallace, and the nickname Mother's Milk originated from the fact that he needed his mother's breast milk to survive. Seriously, without it, his body would start to shrivel up, his heart rate would slow down, and there was no found treatment except for what his mom could pump out. That origin doesn't exist for this character, which is fine because it doesn't take away the strengths his fans do remember him for. He's the heart of the group and keeps a level-headed mind, always being the voice of reason in most cases. In his introduction, we see his ability to control the situation and place himself as a steady role model for whoever comes his way.
You both know how to write in the English language in a passable fashion. I know that because I've seen to it myself, have I not?
Yes, sir.
Not the most laid-back environment, but he enjoys the work he does and considers it a decent life. But that all changes once Butcher comes back in the picture. MM isn't trying to get involved, but the second Butcher mentions Translucent's death, Dad starts entertaining the thought of rejoining on the conditions that things will be different than last time and that the Frenchman won't be coming back. So Butcher does what he does best. Lies. Butcher tries to control the situation, but the tension really dies after MM softens up from a phone call with his wife, Monique, who doesn't know that he's back with the boys. They all have a laugh and call the truth for the time being, putting all their focus on their next big league. In the previous episode, before Translucent died, he spilled the beans on A-Train's secret love with this B-list superhero known as Popclaw, and his frequent visits to her place, including the day Robin died. So with that, they're staking her place out with the plan to bug it for information. It's a similar situation in the comics where they are infiltrating the main base for Teenage Kicks and gathering as much information as they could for blackmail purposes, but on a much less grander scale. With Huey's tech skills, the job is done a lot easier, but almost fails as he freezes up by the side of A-Train, saved only by the convenience of the suit not remembering him at all.
You want an autograph or something?
MM escorts them out, and they all group back in the van to spy on the rocky relationship between A-Train and Popclaw, his kinks, and more importantly, his addiction to Compound V, which is what he was on the day Robin was murdered, and what he needs to outperform another runner known as Shockwave. Otherwise, Vought will toss him to the curb and treat him like the B-Train. Speaking of Vought, Annie is finally sitting down with Madison to discuss the date rape incident from the last episode. Apparently, the situation resolved itself, since the victim came forward after seeing the video, boosting Starlight's numbers. However, that joy is immediately drained as the company works on capitalizing the buzz, and the marketing team decides that the best course of action was this new wardrobe that's a little more revealing and much to Annie's discomfort. As much as she hates the design, it is infinitely more better than the one they tried to push on her in the comics. After the elimination of one of their best money-making teams, Vought was looking to compensate and put all that financial pressure on the Seven, which meant new character designs and reimagined origin stories, particularly Starlight's. In some way, connecting the date rape incident to the costume change isn't that far off from how it was in the comics. The people at Vought were redefining her new origin story by saying that she was raped, and that experience was leading her towards a dark path, which I guess in their minds was enough justification to make her wear this insulting outfit made up of nothing but panty and strings. The company and even members of the Seven were trying to push this outfit on her, and it was only thanks to Queen Maeve who stepped in and prevented this crime of fashion from ever seeing the light of day. On the discussion of Maeve, we get a peek into her life, which is radically different from how it was in the comics. It wouldn't be until much later in the season that we learn at one point she lived a similar lifestyle to her comic book counterpart. For example, in this scene, she's training with a group of men as part of her daily schedule, and that already is more productive of her time than the comics' portrayal of her always calling in guys to pretty much satisfy her sexual desires, even though it was never enough. Her training regimen is interrupted by a call from Vought to accompany Homelander in handling the shooter. That problem is nothing compared to the gripe Homelander has against Vought and their demands to have him and the rest of the Seven at the race to publicly show their support for A-Train and, more importantly, push the company's agenda for having Supes in the military. Meanwhile, the boys are doing their own reconnaissance mission by sneaking into the locker room to try and snatch A-Train's stash of Compound V. The plan is almost compromised by Starlight until Huey recognizes her and uses that connection to stall for time. In the comics, it took a long while, about halfway through the series run, for Huey to learn that Annie was a superhero, with a much more nasty reaction on his part. However, this early reveal works in the show's favor to make the inevitable relationship happen faster as she gives him her number. As the event concludes with A-Train's victory, the boys leave empty-handed, but MM had his wits about keeping an eye on Popclaw. She's watching the race from home, waiting for the moment A-Train goes public with their relationship, but since he declared himself a single man, she upsettingly injects herself with Compound V and blows off some steam. The situation takes a turn though once her landlord comes by asking for the rent money. Thinking she can get away with flirtatious methods, Popclaw talks him into doing some roleplay. But because she took a second dose of V right before a harmless game of cop and robber, she accidentally played with him a little too hard. And let's just say, she really squashed his melon. The boys waited long enough for this kind of criminalizing footage and confronts Popclaw into telling them all she knows about Compound V. You'd think they finally got the upper hand, but at the same time, Translucent has found his way back to Vought Tower. One of the deep sea creatures found this box at the bottom of the harbor, filled with Translucent's bodily pieces and a clear declaration of war. This message alone shows another critical difference between the comic and show, as it pretty much jumped over several story arcs to bring the fight against the Seven a lot closer. When I discovered this, I was genuinely surprised how much story material was skipped in favor of something that was pretty much endgame in the comics. At the same time though, it was the best change for the show to keep the Seven and Vought as the main antagonists. Don't get me wrong, I had an absolute blast discovering these story arcs and witnessing the numerous parodies of these other superhero teams, but I won't lie and say that in doing so, the whole thing with Vought and Huey's anger against A-Train is still there, but remains on the back burner until several volumes later. For how the show did it, the focus isn't lost and it's very clear on who the boys are ultimately trying to take down. In episode 4, Butcher feels like he's gotten enough dirt to try and get the CIA involved again, and brings it all to Susan Raynor, the Deputy Director of CIA Operations. Their relationship was extremely complicated in the comics. She did not like this man at all, that much was clear, but that didn't stop her from hating as a means to cheat on her husband. They both were terrible people to each other, but Butcher was getting the most out of these sexcapades in terms of governmental resources. The show even kind of hinted at this, the same way it did with Queen Maeve about their old fling in episode 2, when Butcher snuck into her home to get some cases on Translucent.
And what we had was you trying to use me for a get out of jail free card at a time like this.
It wasn't going to work the same as before, and what Butcher brings to her isn't enough without a concrete sample of Compound V. Butcher calls up Popclaw to check if she's lying about A-Train getting his Compound V from a noodle shop, but she's insistent that it's somewhere around the area because he would always return with sesame noodles. The boys have been watching for almost a week, ready to call it quits until Frenchie spots a potential pickup, and they all follow this guy to a locked back room inside an Asian market. They keep a low profile, searching for any trace of Compound V, but instead find the final member of the group, the female. In the comics, she is the primary muscle of the group, alongside Frenchie. The boys read about her case file and thought that she could be a useful asset to their cause, mainly for her superpowered strength and ferocious nature. Similar to Huey and Frenchie, she didn't originate in the US. They had to fly out to Tokyo together, in the midst of one of her escapes that kinda worked in their favor. However, these boys have no clue what they stumbled upon and accidentally released her from her cage. The captors are late in warning them not to release her and are defaced from her vicious wrath. The boys lock themselves before getting involved with any of that and allow her to run free. Butcher joins afterwards to help with the investigation, and they learn that all the Compound V they were looking for was being injected into this caged woman. So now they are tasked of tracking her down before Vought. Except for Huey though. With his connection to Starlight, Butcher sees this as an opportunity to keep tabs of the Seven, and sends Huey on this bowling date so he can bug her phone. This here is another great example of how the show utilized its characters over the comics, because it seemed like wasted potential for how this was never an idea that was explored. The way he dealt with Huey and Starlight's relationship never went as far as just trying to break him up for Huey's protection. In his own mind, Butcher always likes to think he's helping Huey by bringing him down to his level of hatred. But when it's done in the comics, it's manipulative, mean-spirited, and doesn't lead to any growth on his part. Yet with the show, the dramatized execution is welcome and gives all characters some benefit of the doubt, even if it ain't the right time yet.
She's a soup, Huey, just like the rest of them.
I can't express enough how much I love the way this show handled these characters, because some of them really need an uplift. Let's go back to one of my favorite characters on this, the Deep. You know, we had his strong introduction at the start, showing his strengths with charm, confidence, and charisma, but up until this point, we start to see other soups chip away at his overall usefulness to the team. We saw a bit of that with Annie from her time on patrol, and this other scene where Homelander confronts him about going into specifics with Madison about the mayor's plane crash. These were two major scenes that made him feel inferior, and that feeling is further explored in this therapy session where he just really gets deep about his role in the Seven compared to the rest of his co-workers.
I'm the diversity hire. I'm a joke.
In their eyes, he's just a fish guy, and it was so interesting for the show to base his character arc around the age-old criticisms of Aquaman being useless without water. From here on out, the Deep sets out on this path to self-discovery and seeks out more confidence for who he is and what he wants out of life. What he wants right now is to save the dolphins from this water park, Oceanland, after hearing about all the animal cruelty they've experienced. It's a cause he's really passionate about, but when he brings this up to Madison, she immediately shuts him down, reminding him that he is the literal face of that water park and that he should just
play to your strengths.
However, feeling like he's had just about enough of everyone downplaying him, the Deep does a poorly planned rescue mission on his own, but it isn't long till the cops force him to stop and the whole plan blows up in his face. Alright, I think you get the picture. I genuinely believe Madison would have heard him out, but it was just really bad timing as she just got an inside tip about a hijacked plane over international waters. This was her golden opportunity to prove that Soups would be an essential part of the military, and sends both Homelander and Queen Maeve to bring the passengers back safely. Keeping up with Vought's history and influence with some of America's most historical events, this hijacking was initially 9/11, when terrorists have taken over and aimed a plane to fly into one of the Twin Towers. Fighter jets were being ordered to take down the plane, but because Vought had an inside man during this time, the pilots were told to stand down for the Seven to arrive. The real players in this were Homelander and Queen Maeve, which is why the show sends only these two. But in the comics, the whole squad, even the ones who couldn't fly, were sent to handle this. And this is how I came to remember a small detail about Queen Maeve that isn't much of a big difference, but it is relevant to this scene, which is she can fly in the comics, but not in the show. In any case, this was a complete show on Vought's part. It became the golden example for why Supes shouldn't be part of the military. Since we know now that the company stages a lot of their crime fighting for clout, just imagine how it would be to be placed in this hostage situation with no cameras or directions on how to perform. The show really made them look a lot more competent and composed as opposed to the visible stress and stupidity their comic counterparts were expressing. Like, Homelander rips the emergency door off, letting one kid fly out and leaving the rest to panic, which got so annoying to the point that he screams at them to shut up and simultaneously breaks all their eardrums in the process. The Deep was dropped off at the front of the plane and tries breaking the main window for entrance, but all that did was allow the jet stream to rush in. They were also banking on Black Noir to land the plane since he's the only one with any experience, but he was dropped before even making it inside. It's not like the movies where the superheroes suddenly know how to resolve the situation. The boys give realistic examples for why extreme training and team coordination are needed to handle these situations, and why it takes more than some men in tights to resolve the issue. Once Vought got involved and took over, these poor passengers were doomed from the start. Whether it be lasering the controls or breaking the plane in an attempt to balance it, Homelander just decided that he'd done enough and decided to call it a day.
We're done here.
While it does reveal a bit of Vaught's incompetence to believe that they could have done this without help, the show reconstructs this moment to Maeve's character development, as the decision to join Homelander and leaving the rest to die would haunt her for the seasons to come. And another big change is the impact it had on the world. In the comics, Homelander's attempt to fix the issue redirected the incident to destroy the Brooklyn Bridge. But because this happened in the middle of the ocean, no one really knew what happened except for the people that were there, and became this opportune moment for Homelander to twist the narrative in his favor to continue pushing Vaught's agenda and indirectly winning points with Madison.
If they let us into the military, then this will never happen again. That is my solemn promise to you.
And as it turns out, they're not the only Supes today trying to cover their tracks. Back to the female plot, A-Train takes notice of the crime scene around the place he's been in Compound V and confronts Popclaw about her telling anyone. She denies ever mentioning it, and all A-Train could really do is just accept it for the time being and tell her to pack up and leave while he tries and sorts this out himself. Alongside the boys, they are all following the trail of the female. First at a nail salon where she killed the manager, and then at Penn Station thanks to Frenchie's deduction skills. He's the first one to track her in an electronics store, but she is quickly spooked into running again. They chase her right into one of the subway tracks where A-Train comes rushing at her and starts beating her senselessly, only saved by Frenchie's quick thinking to use the Soup's celebrity status against them and allow the female to escape. They finally manage to corner her, and Frenchie makes one final attempt to do this peacefully, but she comes at him, leaving Butcher no choice but to toss a gas can Frenchie received earlier in the episode, knocking them both out. It's a similar way to how they captured her in the comics, and in both cases secured their new member without any harm. Episode 5 is all about Believe, and by that I mean Vaught's Christianity event where they spread the good name of the Lord, along with some snacks, merchandise, live suit performances, and highly expensive tier levels to be baptized by the Homelander himself. However, the boys aren't here just for the festivities and the chance to deconstruct values.
I'm sorry, did you just call God a C-word?
After MM learned in the last episode that the empty package of Compound V they found in the female's prison was connected to a soup kitchen called Samaritan's Embrace, they now had their eyes on questioning the religious soup who runs it, Ezekiel. He was actually introduced in episode 1 as part of Huey's exposure to the reality of soups. For someone whose whole agenda is to pray the gay away, the hypocrisy in his actions will be enough to damage his reputation, unless he gives up any info about his involvement involvement with Compound V. The only real issue on their hands today is finding a way to get close to him, with the only solution being this VIP experience in exchange for $15,000. Butcher leaves that task to Huey since he's got a tight connection with Starlight and can simply ask her for a diamond pass. During this arc in the comics, Frenchie and the female were originally in charge of gathering the intel, but since their partnership had barely just begun, this episode builds upon their small spark of connection established before her capture, with Frenchie's belief that she is more than a monster. And that gets tested by a team up between A-Train and Black Noir. With the help of Homelander, the A-Train orchestrated a plan to have Popclaw finally spill the beans about her assistant to the boys right before he sticks 4 syringes in her arm and kills her with an overdose. Feeling very distraught over doing this, he ends up back in her apartment watching her old movies. He then decides to pull out the nanny cam he secretly placed to relive some of the best they ever had, but what he finds instead is the moment she was being blackmailed and the camera revealing Frenchie's face. As soon as he discovers this, he and Black Noir start looking into Frenchie, pretty soon visiting all his hideouts. It is only because of his friend Cherie that he learns he's been burned, and when he relays this back to Butcher, he's told to leave the female and run. Frenchie, however, could not do that and instead releases her from the shackles, which ended up working in his favor. As Black Noir finally catches up to him, the female intercepts and engages in a fight against the Batman parody, right up until she's given the fatal slice and left to die on the streets. Or so we think. It's revealed here that the female also has regenerative powers to heal herself, which wasn't the case in the comics. Only time will tell what the showrunners have planned for this newly added ability. But let's get back to the real focus of this episode, which is the Believe Expo, and the 2 Supes forced in attendance. Let's start with Annie, who's not seeing these events the same way she used to ever since she became part of the 7. In these last couple of months, Vought has slowly chipped away at her glossed view of superheroes, with the crude reality seeping in at every corner. Returning to this expo, she initially thought it would be a breath of fresh air and give her some peace of mind, but visiting the expo is not the same as being a part of it. She sees that very clearly in this scene where she's talking to a group of teens, but not really allowed to express her own voice that doesn't align with Vaught's.
Jesus also says to love your neighbor.
But if you love your neighbor, don't you want to save them from damnation? You have a chance to help your friend find eternal life.
But she's not the only Supe here scheduled to have their voice suppressed. Homelander is also planned to make an appearance, but he has had quite the day so far. Not just the stuff with A-Train, but also attending a memorial service to honor the victims of that plane crash he caused. And after doing this forced speech, he's expected to do another one at the expo, under some talking points that would appeal to the government and further push Vaught's agenda. Homelander thinks he can wing this thing on his own and requests to talk with Madison, but apparently she isn't here. So he bullies Ashley into revealing her location so he can have a chat about the speech. It's probably worth noting now that Madison has a child and is burdened with juggling the responsibilities of caring for both her real child and work child. I am not exaggerating when I say Homelander is literally competing against a baby for Madison's affections. Really makes all his recent actions more psychotic when you realize that it's all for attention. Sometimes when he's alone, he just stands out in the hall using his x-ray vision to peer into her office and creepily watch her pump breast milk. It's a very disturbing obsession, and she finally calls him out on it when he flies over to her as she's trying to take her kid to see the pediatrician. She tries her best to stay composed and reasonable, but once he calls her baby an accessory, that's when she puts her foot down.
We need boundaries.
Homelander did not like that one bit, so he essentially sabotages his speech at the expo, going completely off script, ignoring the planned corporate talk, and paints himself as the primary solution to America's problems. As he's feeling the pinnacle high of his self-inflated ego, Madison is angered by his rebellious attitude. But instead of expressing her anger like adults, she scolds him like a child, and from this point on figures that this is the only way to keep control of him and get him to behave.
You have to be good, and you have to listen to me.
Homelander is the only exception to this disturbing treatment, because I know damn well Madison isn't gonna coddle Annie for the she pulled during her speech. After the day she's been having, along with everything else she's endured, Annie also decides to go off script and use her platform to speak her truth. She practically criticizes Vought for trying to make a profit off Fate, becomes honest about the things she was forced to suppress, and comes clean about being sexually assaulted by a member of the Seven. When all is said and done, she leaves to be on her own, not even happy to see Huey as she's also been feeling used by him. However, that conversation is kinda sidelined once he vaguely tells her about Robin's death, and how he was trying to look forward to something from this expo to relieve him from the pain, but the only thing that really did it was the honesty in her speech. He manages to win over her sympathies, hugging it out and beginning the true start to their relationship. But no good relationship is ever built on lies, and he continues to keep his secrets, such as what he was really doing with Ezekiel earlier in the evening. He managed to get into the Diamond Club, but first had to survive a baptism session with Homelander, which caused his phone to break and lose the blackmail footage he was going to use against Ezekiel. However, getting specific with the details was enough to reveal Compound V being shipped to numerous hospitals, including the recent shipment to the Mercer Hospital in Midtown. Once the information is relayed, Butcher and MM go there to investigate further, and while they do find more of the V, they also discover what this hospital is using them for, leaving us with the biggest reveal for this episode.
Jesus. That's a baby soup.
The decision to storyboard this reveal within the Believe episode was genius. For how much these soups come on stage to declare that their abilities were a gift from God, to spend their entire event playing up this idea, it made the reveal of this secret that's been teased since the very start of this season all the more impactful. And this is another great example for the show's execution with certain details, because in the comics, this was common knowledge by the third issue. Without giving too much away, the secret of Compound V was established very early on during Huey's first mission with the boys. They classified it as a steroid when they witnessed the effects it had on Popclaw, but this discovery goes way beyond that and can fill the gaps for some of the discussions we had earlier in this review. How did the weapons manufacturing company find themselves with superheroes? They got their hands on the formula that made it possible. Why did MM in the comics require his mother's milk to survive? Because before he and his brother Michael were born, she worked at a canning plant that used to be a Vought factory, and because the company never sterilized the area before giving away the building, traces of unrefined Compound V affected the workers and altered their organic chemistry. This reveal of Compound V is inviting to both the boys and ourselves. From here on out, these explanations will be a little more clearer with the secret of Compound V finally being out there, at least for us viewers. As for the boys, this was the first real step into taking Vought down for good. The framing for this episode is kinda hilarious when you think about it. In an attempt to make a promotional video that should have highlighted the Seven's capabilities to be put in the army, one editor accidentally made a down-to-earth segment called Super in America, showing the heroes being one with their community. While the segment itself is not what the company asked for, the timing of it all would be very welcome to douse the flames of recent incidents Vought has been connected to, even with the secret of Compound V still under wraps. I'm gonna start with the Deep first, since his involvement with the main story kinda shrinks after this episode. The whole incident with the dolphin rescue is practically nothing compared to the scandal between him and Starlight, and it would only be a matter of time before people start piecing it together that she was talking about him. Madison acts on this quick and makes him declare a public apology before sending him off to Sandusky, Ohio, where he will remain for the rest of the season. They call it a sabbatical leave, but we really know what's being done here. With very little activity going on in the area, there will be no way for him to be publicized again. So in time, he'll be phased from everyone's mind, including his involvement in the Seven. Honestly, this will probably be the last time I talk about the Deep in general, so I'll wrap up the rest of his scenes in this segment, which isn't much but does offer periods of reflection he desperately needed, if you recall the loss of purpose he expressed in therapy. Aside from now being hated by most women, he spends the rest of his screen time working on a memoir, getting a taste of karma as this assertive fan goes fishing inside his man clams, and feels downright useless when he couldn't even save a store-bought lobster from captivity.
Wait.
The only thing that kept him going was the false promise that Vought would remember him and bring him back on the team. But when this company's branch manager breaks the news that he isn't going anywhere, the Deep suffers a mental breakdown and shaves off his hair in response. We won't know how his character will turn out until next season, but one thing I can tell you, the image of the Deep that we know will cease to exist. Once you have the clarity to look at your past actions, to separate yourself from the toxicity that surrounds you, only then can you begin to heal. And for the Deep, this was his time to get real deep with his thoughts. So, yeah, the Deep is now on a sabbatical leave from this review. With that said, let's check back with the other soups in America. Homelander is doing the segment talking about his fake childhood home and upbringing, which leads into a massive trigger moment since someone on set brought in a blanket from his actual childhood experience, which would later be revealed to be this cold, sterile lab room with scientists looking over him. This is pretty accurate to the comics, as Homelander was the first fetus to be injected with refined compound V, and being the first official soup, no one understood how wild and violent the birthing process would be, which is why he was monitored until they were sure he'd mellow out. It was so serious that they not only confined him to some silo for 18 years, but also kept a hydrogen bomb close by in case they needed a failsafe. That was his real origin story, but Vought would obviously rewrite it for their grand introduction to the public, following an origin similar to Superman's, with the baby found in the spaceship. As of right now, I don't remember the full extent of Homelander's origin in the show, but to give him the Clark Kent lifestyle seemed like the obvious route to take. But because of that blanket, it triggers something in Homelander to really get fed up with the fakeness of it all. But one rub up from Madison and Homelander remains obedient once more. But from this scene, it's clear to see that her methods are starting to lose its effect. Queen Maeve is also doing her portion of the segment, but is interrupted by her ex-lover, Elena. Ever since the plane incident, Maeve has been struggling to cope with the traumatic memory ingrained in her mind. In the previous episode, she paid a drunk visit to Elena's apartment, expecting this reunion to be safe, but is met with anger as Elena never got a chance to move on since she's always seeing Maeve in some capacity. She keeps telling Maeve to leave, but once she mentions Homelander, the soup just breaks down on the floor crying. And as much as Elena wants to help, Maeve butchers the moment with a drunk kiss, and then leaves without explaining the breakdown. This scene is Elena trying to pick up that conversation again, but since Maeve is trying to remain tough and avoids the chance to become vulnerable, she's called out for what she really is.
Afraid to be seen with me, afraid to ask for help, just afraid.
The show's direction of Queen Maeve's character is great in the sense of trying to open the conversation about vulnerability within masculine figures. Seeing this in other series like Rocky or Yakuza, to be shown different levels of positive masculinity really sends a great message that should no longer be shamed or criticized. In the context of this series, she used to be just like Starlight until the weight of the job finally broke her down to suit Vought's expectations, and has kind of stayed that way until Annie's recent addition. After the whole Believe fiasco, Ashley got fired and Annie was called an ungrateful diva for not going along with the program. However, none of this makes her back down. In fact, she doubles down and makes more demands, saying she won't take part in the Super in America segment and isn't afraid of being fired since she knows that would only make the company look bad from the recent allegations. She feels real proud of standing her ground, much to Queen Maeve's disbelief, who's projecting the idea that this is all just an act to raise her numbers. With all sincerity, Starlight responds by reminding Maeve of an event she read in the soup's autobiography about how she saved a falling school bus at the expense of her right arm, and even visited those kids at their physical therapy sessions. Maeve was Starlight's biggest inspiration for becoming a superhero, but being under Vought's main house gave her the impression that there were no genuine heroes, and that even the hero she looked up to the most was part of the facade.
Now, pretty sure that was just written by the marketing guys.
It is because of these two women that Maeve starts to touch back with her vulnerability and show that she's capable of actually caring again. And this shows when Starlight sees how Vought could do the promotional footage without her. It isn't a complete alliance, but she starts small and offers her sympathy.
I'm sorry.
And that's pretty much of Vought's side for this episode. I didn't include Black Noir because he's still just a silent comic relief with every scene of his being absolute gold. As for the A-Train, the only thing you need to know is that without Compound V, he's starting to experience some withdrawal symptoms. Something Homelander pointed out in the previous episode, and something we will explore further in the latter half of this season. But for now, let's check back in on the boys as some of their innocence is being tested and challenged. From here, it's safe to say that Hughie and Annie have officially started dating, much to Butcher's annoyance. After everything he's been trying to prove about all soups being nothing more than bad news, the fact that Hughie begins to date one is absolute bonkers to him, as if nothing was retained from their previous missions. So, in a cool and calm manner, Butcher takes Hughie out, surprising him with a visit to this meeting for people who recognize themselves as collateral damage to the soups they have either encountered or hooked up with. Even the guy who does Vaught's marketing is here, describing his intimacy with this soup known as the Ice Princess, and while it sounded like she had a good time, things couldn't be said the same for this mere mortal.
She climaxed and accidentally turned into ice. As you can imagine, it snapped off.
Just like in the comics, Butcher has always tried to keep Hughie's desires for vengeance afloat. He wanted to channel that anger towards A-Train against all soups, including the innocent ones like Starlight. The only difference is that comic book Butcher would always assume the worst and go to extreme lengths to justify his point. When he first witnessed these two together, before Hughie even learned that she was with the Seven, Butcher's first thought was to believe that Hughie was a spy for Vought. And before even talking to him about it, he sends the guy on a dangerous solo mission that almost led to his death. And when Hughie does confide in Butcher about learning Annie's superhero identity and is considering the idea to try and make it work, Butcher manipulates his decision by showing him surveillance footage of the horrendous moment Annie had to blow half the team to keep her position, which is also different from how he and the rest of the world found out in the show. Hughie was sickened by what he saw, and Butcher took this opportunity to really twist the narrative and say that this is how they all are, and that she was probably treating Hughie as nothing more than a joke, which couldn't be any more wrong, but that's who Butcher is. It doesn't matter if the soup has a good heart or is just full of himself, a soup is a soup, and in his mind, they're all evil. So it really boils his veins to be sitting in a room with victims who, even though have fallen on hard times because of these heroes, would still praise their existence and genuinely miss what they had.
Where's your rage? Your self-respect?
By now, you're probably wondering, where does all this rage come from? Like this woman here, she tries to get Butcher to open up, but it isn't until a later scene when he's sitting with Hughie that he begins to share his personal experience with a soup that led to the disappearance of his wife, Rebecca Butcher. Most of Butcher's origin story could be found in his spin-off volume, and you'd see right away that he didn't have the best upbringing. It didn't help that his dad was an abusive drunk, but there was always a pocket of violence that existed in his nature and would find its calling on the front lines. However, even after the war, he had trouble controlling his violent tendencies and would always get in trouble, which led to his discharge and the continuous spiral towards destruction until he came across his first and eternal love, Becky Saunders. She was the angel that helped change his life for the better. She got him to stop drinking, getting into random bar fights, and even helped his mom get away from the abusive relationship she was stuck in. From every angle, Becky will remain the woman who saved Butcher from himself, and it completely destroyed him when he learned of her fate.
Homelander right there.
I really liked the decision to disclose that information for this episode, not because it was a more emotional method to try and clamp Hughie to his personal viewpoint on soups, but to demonstrate Karl Urban's ability to humanize this chaotic man into something more than a walking ball of hate. That was something I really hated about Butcher in the comics. I didn't mind if he was all dark, stubborn, and hell-bent on eliminating soups to an extreme degree, but there was no one to really challenge him. Sure, some characters could stand up to him and even be at his level, but it didn't seem like nothing would ever change his mind or viewpoint, and it just got annoying to wait for this change and thought that would never happen. However, the show's Butcher is built different, not just because of the writing, but because of the actor that brought humanity to the role and highlighted the best parts of his character, especially when it comes to Huey.
You and me, we're in this together.
All this to get Huey on his side, which is kind of reinforced once he finds out what the other half of the boys were up to behind his back. After MM recaps all they have learned thus far in the season, Frenchie pulls at one loose thread and wonders why the female was secretly being injected with Compound V as an adult. Butcher doesn't see the relevance in finding the answer, but after he leaves with Huey, Frenchie convinces MM to help him figure out the female's past by taking her to the Mesmer. The meta humor in casting Haley Joel Osment as this child star Soup from this popular television series was downright amazing. And instead of seeing dead people, he could see people's thoughts and memories by the mere touch.
What number am I thinking of?
867?
Amazing.
Yes. Yes, he is amazing. MM ambushes the Soup at a convention, promising him monthly supervised meetings with his estranged daughter if he can read this silent woman and provide some insight on her past. But in the process of reliving such traumatic memories, she panics and breaks the Soup's arm. It's not long until Butcher tracks down their location and reluctantly joins in on the fun, which goes a lot more smoothly in the second session, revealing that she's part of a terrorist group called the Shining Light Liberation Army. This adds a new layer to Vought's current agenda, as Soup terrorists are being created to force the government's hand to place Soups in the army, since they'll be the only ones capable of dealing with this immense threat. Butcher is convinced the female is fully on this diabolical plan and can't be trusted until she summons the Mesmer for one last session to fully unlock her past. At a young age, this same terrorist group killed off her parents and took her and her brother from their home, being forced to become soldiers for their cause. We also learn that her name is Kimiko, which is something that we never learned from the comics, but that's understandable given her original background. With Frenchie translating her life story to Huey, death always seemed to run down her family tree. But as she kept repeating, it was never because of Hiroshima. It was one wild misfortune after another, and the only one who seemed to thrive was her mother, who just had incredible dumb luck and didn't need to make any effort to succeed in life. Pretty cheap too. Because of that, she didn't bother putting her daughter in a daycare and always brought her along to her job, which was at this Tokyo company working to replicate their own synthetic copy of Compound V. One day, the female snuck off on her own and stumbled upon a room with these scientists being scolded for not disposing this batch of V that apparently looked like baby food but was extremely unstable and shouldn't have been left out in the open. Because of this, the female ends up eating her batch and develops her superpowers, leading to her inevitable capture. Since she ate the batch and killed the only doctor who knew how to replicate it, she was subjected to years of experimentation and blood extractions, treated more like an animal than a human being. She assumed her mom forgot about her or was paid off, so she never expected some chance of a rescue. She was capable of escaping on her own, but will always be stunned by the outside world, learning about something new, but never being able to make sense of it before she's captured again. The show was a lot kinder in giving her a brother, but still does a great job highlighting the fact that her childhood was essentially taken from her, and being forced against her will to follow the agenda of a higher authority until she landed with the boys, specifically Frenchie. Initially, they collected her in the hopes of having a real killing machine on their hands, but Frenchie took one look and saw a girl who needed the right guiding hand to rehabilitate her back into the social norms of society. It was through that kindness that she lowered her guard around him, and that same kindness that would keep her around for the long run. As much as I want to say that Frenchie can do no wrong, he's still human, and with this visit, he really jeopardized the boys' mission. MM has criticized his impulses in the past, leading them into trouble, such as the decision to let Kimiko out of her prison in 2 different occasions. But if it wasn't for those moments, they wouldn't have ended up with a real badass on their side. Yet, going to the Mesmer was probably a step too far, as none of them could have guessed he would back away from the deal with his daughter and give up their identities to Homelander, putting them all in incredible danger. Episode 7 is essentially the beginning of the end, at least for this season. The lies that have or haven't been discussed are slowly unraveling in front of our very eyes in the messiest of ways. The biggest truth bomb comes from Homelander, who brings in all the remaining members of the Seven together to reveal Huey, Butcher, and the rest of the boys as existing threats to Vought and their livelihoods. This is different from the comics, as the Seven were already made aware of the boys even before Huey joined the group. In fact, they were so well acquainted that they kept a pact to keep the peace between each other in order to prevent a war from erupting. With the show's execution of events though, it allowed this reveal to have a grander impact and heighten the tension, such as when Starlight is put on the hot seat and almost branded a traitor by her unaware connection to all this.
Whoa.
Keep those hands down by your sides, Missy.
Homelander is starting to take a dark turn with this confrontation until Queen Maeve breaks the tension, saying that Annie was used and convinces him to let this go. So he does, dispersing the group and allowing them to deal with the situation in their own way. With the Supes now catching on, this means trouble for the boys, especially when Huey gets the call from the A-Train on his dad's cell, knowing right away that they've all been burned. Butcher is quick to blame Annie, but since MM jumps on her defense and claims that she's never seen them, they rationalize that the Mesmer betrayed them and disperse to handle business and protect their families. Huey returns home and tries to save his old man from the A-Train. He's been told to come alone, and much to the Soup's amusement, that appears to be the case. But he sure didn't come empty-handed.
What? What's wrong with
I have a bigger dose.
Tempting the addict with another hit, Huey gets his dad out of the house and keeps the Soup talking long enough until Kimiko enters through the ceiling and breaks his legs with a crowbar, decommissioning the A-Train for a good while. MM also returns home to secure his family, who we're seeing for the first time this season. The show did his background justice by rewriting how his home life was originally portrayed, which was just insultingly ghetto. I don't know, to me this was a moment that just felt so random, because with the upbringing that MM had in the comics, I thought he would have had better sense than to hook up with a known drug addict who carried so much baggage, had zero qualifications to raise a child, and was overall a terrible influence that automatically made MM better by comparison. As for Janine, she also had the effects of Compound V in her veins, making her look a lot older than her actual age. Makes these scenes of her hanging out with these gangbangers disturbing when realistically she's like 12. And her relationship with MM is muddled since she's always feeling neglected from all that time he spends with the boys, and would rather spend time with her mother, who did keep her child at a crack house when she was just half a year old. So there's no question on who wrote MM's family better, but because he decided to join the boys again, against his wife's wishes, they were brought back into the chaos and forced to stay in hiding for a while. Meanwhile, Butcher finally tracks down the Mesmer and starts giving the Soup his just desserts for betraying them. Throughout this beatdown, the Mesmer is catching glimpses of Butcher's past and tries using that to plead for his life. But that just makes Butcher even more mad and lets the Soup see something so terrifying, no words need to be said. Even though the Mesmer gave us glimpses, the episode itself does reveal a bit more about Becca's disappearance and tying a stronger connection between Butcher, Homelander, and Vought as a whole. In this flashback of the company's Christmas party, we learned that Becca used to be the company's old publicist before Ashley came into the picture, which is different from her original job as a social worker, justifying her level of compassion and patience working with the roughest of kids, and even Butcher. Since they were both primarily living in Europe, they had no clue about Vought or the superhero trend until they took a trip to Miami, Florida, seeing the Seven arrive and mingle with fans. Becky shared Butcher's mindset about these Soups looking stupid, but since the show reframed their characters to become more Americanized, we get a depiction of them falling in line with Vaught's overreaching influence, at least with Rebecca. Butcher still carries over his annoyance with the Soups and even tries to escape the night with a few drinks, but not on Becca's watch.
Whoa, easy, Tiger. I want you in the A game.
However, days after the party, Rebecca suddenly goes missing, and a distraught Butcher is visited by Grace Mallory, former director of the CIA and the person who initially formed the Boys. Greg Mallory in the comics had just as much hatred for the Supes after he witnessed their bad influence as a World War II veteran, and saw firsthand just how much of a problem they will become down the line. So he eventually joined the CIA and created a group that would personally handle this issue, with Butcher as his first recruit. Similar to how Huey was approached, Mallory approaches Butcher at his most vulnerable, showing him video footage of Homelander sneaking Rebecca into a room for 3 hours, with her leaving trashed and used. In the comics, he was handed her diary in which she privately described the incident in full detail, expressing her complete inferiority to fight against the situation and throwing Butcher into a violent fit once grasping the whole story. With this, he was on board to help Mallory, as she made a promise to give him Homelander when the time came.
I'm the person who can get you payback.
But his desire for payback has gotten to the point where it's putting his boys and their families' lives in jeopardy. In the last episode, Butcher actually had a chance to secure government protection with all the evidence he brought Raynor, but because she couldn't promise giving him Homelander, he backs away from the deal, lying to the rest that it was up to them now, leading to the most miserable Parents' Day gathering I have ever seen. MM is the only one who understands Butcher and makes a really solid guess what really happened with the deal, despite the denial. Whatever the reason, MM just tells Butcher to make this right, for all their sakes. And a couple scenes later, Raynor arrives to give the family security in exchange for the sample of Compound V. Now this is something that I couldn't see Butcher from the comics doing, which is why his show counterpart is a more balanced character who could be reasoned with and understood that his lust for vengeance could be traded for their own personal safety. As one guy decides, at least for the moment, to put the past behind him, there's the other guy who's trying to understand it a little more. Remembering who Butcher was in relation to Vought, Homelander spends the episode looking into Rebecca's disappearance. Madison doesn't provide any insight, so he goes to the one man you could actually call his father, Dr. Jonah Vogelbaum. In both the comics and the show, he is the creator of Compound V, and therefore the one who brought superheroes into our world, including Homelander. After hearing that he's been snooping about Rebecca, Vogelbaum sits him down and explains that she was impregnated with his child. The scandal would have been enormous for Vought, which is why the ordeal was kept hush-hush, and when the time came for delivery, it couldn't have been more gruesome. From his vivid description, the baby clawed out of her, killing her on the spot, and the baby itself dying 10 seconds after. This is kind of how it went in the comics too, but with a few differences. During their vacation in Miami, I guess the Homelander took a glance of her on the beach and decided to have his way, leaving her very quiet and distant, much to Butcher's surprise. Again, since they had no connection to Vought, she wasn't wheeled into an emergency room or nothing, and since the organic chemistry of a baby soup is different, there was an acceleration in its growth. So one random night, Butcher woke up to the disturbing sight of his wife dead on the floor, with the baby hovering and causing havoc, leaving Butcher to spring from the bed and kill the baby with a lamp. There was an earlier scene of him handling the baby that reminded me a lot of this moment, except he had no reason to kill it, but leaves it with a gentle threat to suggest otherwise.
You keep your nose clean, sunshine, or I'll come back and stomp you.
Homelander questions why he's being told the truth now, and Vogelbaum starts to reflect on his past choices, feeling remorseful about not raising the hero in a more supportive and nurturing environment. From this line, Madison's addition to the series started to make more sense, particularly for Homelander's development, and what would happen if that component was lacking. Heck, it was already missing for most of his life, which brings Vogelbaum to outright call Homelander for what he is, in the eyes of a creator.
I'm the world's greatest superhero.
You're my greatest failure.
It's not the power that makes the hero, it's the environment that surrounds them. And I would have bet he would have turned out way differently if he actually had an origin like Superman. Or Starlight for that matter. Speaking of Starlight, after ignoring Huey for the majority of this episode, she finally gets in touch with him and asks to meet up so he can explain himself. The complexity of his journey through this season leaves him speechless, leading her to arrest him on the spot, but he manages to stop her by telling the truth about Compound V.
It gives the Supes their powers. Vought will do anything to cover it up.
Obviously, she's confused by this, and during that confusion, Butcher appears out of nowhere and pumps her with lead, providing Huey a chance to escape the scene before he's captured. Coincidentally, this was probably the best option because of what happens next. Back at the CIA, Raynor's got Madison on the chair, displaying all her evidence and ready to stop Vought for good. Yet, at the worst possible moment, she's pulled from the conversation to review a footage of her team raiding the terrorists who were responsible for that hijacking. As the team appears successful, the last few seconds reveal this captain blowing up the entire quarter and escaping unharmed, leading to the only possible explanation.
Are you telling me they have a suit terrorist?
Yeah, they do. Well, it happened. Once Soup terrorists came into the picture, the military had no choice but to sign a deal with Vought and allow Soups like Homelander to take the lead in these covert operations, much to everyone's discomfort. The one goal that was never achieved in the comics finally came into fruition through the show's adaptation. And this only spelled major trouble for the boys. All the evidence they collected throughout the season has been kept under wraps to keep Vought happy, on top of declaring the boys fugitives for the death of Translucent. MM and Frenchie are already thinking about running, but Butcher's got one last card up his sleeve. He takes Huey to meet with Grace Mallory, who, like in the comics, kept her distance from the action after the aforementioned Lamplighter incident. They made an agreement to never get in contact with each other ever again. And to Butcher's credit in the comics, he honored that promise until it became an inconvenience. But this Butcher is on his last legs and fishing for something that could help him get out of the situation. So with the promise that he wouldn't reach out like this again, Mallory gives him one crucial piece of information.
Madeline Stillwell.
Vought's VP.
It's all they got, so Butcher runs with it. He and Huey return to the area, realizing that their temporary hideout has been burned by Vaught's personal Black Ops unit, and have already captured the rest of the boys. Huey wants to go save them, and when he realizes how fixated Butcher is on getting Homelander, he stands his ground and refuses to join them, leading to their split. Knowing there's no way he could do this on his own, Huey finds Annie at the one place that brings her comfort and tries to get her help, which she just couldn't believe. She was almost murdered for simply knowing him, and now he's once again needing her assistance to go against Vought? I mean, this time the reason is just, but still. Right before this, she went back home to confront her mom about Compound V, leading into this emotional rant about every minute of her life being controlled, how this was the reason her dad left them at a young age, and why she's currently struggling to understand who she's supposed to be. So when she sees Huey here asking for her help, she's really confused on how to respond, asking him for an answer. And the answer he gives is pretty simple.
Because you're a superhero.
Not the ones Vought has been pushing on us this whole season, but the genuine heroes who are simply there for the people. Like how she was there for him in that bowling alley, helping him move on from the grief and shadow of Robin's memory. As nice of a gesture that was for him to say, she doesn't believe it, or rather doesn't really care anymore, and carries that attitude over to a fundraising event where she's getting drunk, impressing guys with her powers, and finally giving in to the Vought lifestyle she's been trying so hard not to fall into. She's lost her sense of self and is beginning to swirl down this destructive path until Maeve steps in. She tells Annie that the bus incident they talked about in the elevator was real, that she really did break her arm trying to save those kids. From how she was introduced this season, the transformation of her character really shines in this final scene of hers as she gets vulnerable about the way Vought took away her wide-eyed innocence and doesn't wish for the same things to happen with Starlight. In the kindest way possible, she tells Annie to just be yourself and avoid running down the same path she did at the start.
Be the annoying goody two-shoes asshole that you are.
This talk was just what Annie needed to straighten herself out. And a good time too, because Huey, he would probably be dead without her. To his credit though, he did manage to break the boys out himself. After letting himself get caught, he's taken to where MM and Frenchie are being held captive. And even though they were a little discouraged that Butcher wasn't part of this rescue, they immediately changed their tune once Huey reveals the retainer he snuck in for Frenchie, who could use the metal wiring to pick the locks and escape. As they are looking for an exit, they come across Kimiko held in a room, and are barely given a chance to reconnect until more of Vought's men storm in to control the situation. Huey is left to provide cover while MM runs in to save Kimiko, but it isn't long until they are quickly surrounded and saved by the grace of a bright light. Annie helps them escape, but not before the A-Train stops them. If you remember the last time we saw him, he had his leg broken by Kimiko. Since then, he's been struggling to adapt with his title as the fastest man alive revoked, to the point where he was racially profiled and caused a massive scene in public.
I'm A-Train. I'm the fastest man alive.
Not wanting to feel as invisible as translucent, he gets his hands on Compound V again to restore his leg and start training again to reclaim his glory. But after so many uses, the repercussions would finally show themselves in this final confrontation. It's a quick match against Huey and Starlight, and right as he's about to deliver the killing blow, his heart gives out and he collapses on the floor, being at the complete mercy of these two. In the comics, when Huey finally had his chance against A-Train and in the position where the soup couldn't do no harm, he does actually kill him and ends up choosing revenge. But because this show has been balancing his mind with the consequences of taking a life and the option to choose a different path, Huey's good nature wins out as he starts doing chest compressions while Annie calls for an ambulance. This pretty much completes Huey's arc for this season, and it did not end with him getting revenge. The same can't be said for Butcher though, who's been waiting all night for Madison to return from the fundraising event. She's had quite the night, and it got even better when she was offered a promotion by the CEO of Vought, Stan Edgar. Remember when I said that she was half of a character? Well, this is the other half, under the name of another character who had very little impact in the original comics. He shared one major scene with Stillwell and ends up dying off screen, remaining this shadow figure the whole way through. I don't want to say any more other than the show, once again, expanding upon these characters who had very little relevance, at least the ones that matter. And the fact that they got Gus Fring as the head of Vought, you know he's going to be sticking around for a while. But back to Madison, after getting promoted for bringing soups in the military and having sex with Homelander once he tells her that he and A-Train were the ones who injected the terrorist with Compound V, her entire night crumbles at the hands of the British man. He straps her with bombs, expecting Homelander to come by and save her, which he does, but bringing her baby along for the conversation. Thinking he's got the upper hand, Butcher is surprised at how calm Homelander is about the situation, and that's all thanks to Madison. After their sexy time together, they start talking about the new promotion, and she apologizes for keeping quiet about his baby. But by saying too much, she ended up jeopardizing their promise to never lie to each other almost immediately.
The pain of losing a child to miscarriage is... I just wanted to spare you that burden.
If you remember from last episode, Dr. Vogelbaum described the scenario very differently, contradicting Madison's words. Because of this, Homelander went to Vogelbaum and squeezed the truth out of him to learn the real story. All he really demanded now from her was, for once, some genuine honesty. And she utters the one thing that a Stillwell would never admit, even if they were strapped to a vest full of explosives.
I said I'm scared. Of you.
Feeling very appreciative of her honesty, he gives her a gentle kiss and then quickly melts her eyeballs, screwing over Butcher's plan. However, that ain't gonna stop him from pressing the trigger. The screen flashes white and it's suddenly morning. Butcher wakes up on the lawn, greeted by Homelander, and is shown the truth of what Madison and Vogelbaum were hiding from the world this whole time.
Becca.
In this final scene, we are given one last difference between comic and show, in which Becca is still alive. That whole story Vogelbaum told him, it really went down like that in the comics. But the show's direction with this major reveal keeps the possibilities open to where they could take this narrative. Butcher actually having the chance to save Rebecca? Homelander having the chance to be a father with the son he was hoping for? How are things going to pan out in the future now that their rivalry flipped on its head and brought them closer than ever? Well, like Butcher, you're gonna have to stay with these confusing thoughts and theories until the next season. For that, my friends, was season 1 of The Boys. Now, before I state the obvious, let me finalize my thoughts on the comics, since I don't want them lumped with the majority of the internet's consensus saying that it's complete trash. Because it wasn't all that bad. Sure, it has glaring flaws, but there were some aspects that I personally enjoyed more over the show. My first introduction to this was through the Amazon series, and sitting through every season, the one thing I've always loved and wanted more of was the world building. Seeing the expansive reach of Vought's influence throughout this city, I was always curious about seeing it in different contexts and environments, which was delivered through its spin-off series, but more so in the comics. The power of literature is not limited to production cost and could spread the corporate influence anywhere it wanted, whether it be different regions of the globe or different time periods. Ennis's knowledge and passion for history really kept my attention, and it was fascinating to see the evolution of Vought change over time and how they gained the power they're known for today. All the finer details that expanded upon this idea were really planned out and made the issues much more problematic on a global scale. Certain tropes and material chosen to be satirized were heavily different between the show and comic, with each one poking fun at different aspects of a hero. Some I didn't understand the reference, but most were recognizable, and I had a blast seeing this wild, degenerate version of them. And you might think I'll be crazy for saying this, but there actually was a sense of camaraderie within the boys. Unlike the show's angle to reunite each member one by one, somewhat bitter at the thought, the boys in the comics were intact from the start. And at times you really do get the sense of family from these edgy group of misfits, having each other's back and being totally in sync. Yeah, they're rough around the edges and can be aggressive in a moment's notice, but there's also an uncanny wholesomeness during their downtime, in between cases, and arcs that remind us they're human. For a violent series like this, it really comes out of left field than what you'd expect, but that makes it all the more appreciated when you come across it. So no, it's not all trash. There are some aspects that can hold your engagement. The only problem is that you have to break through aggressive layers of crap just to reach these diamonds in the rough. I do agree with everyone that most of the gore and shocking content is unnecessary at times. When it's at the expense of characters like Huey and Annie, it does serve a purpose in challenging their innocence and seeing the progressive effects it has on both their mindset and daily lifestyle. Season 1 had just the right amount used to make scenes all the more memorable. If that wasn't the case, scenes like the plane crash or the death of Translucent wouldn't carry the same impact. Meanwhile, it gets repetitive and stale in the comics, and you do reach a point where you're constantly questioning the purpose. What was the point of having Huey take an immediate in the middle of an interrogation? Or these soups snorting up Compound V laced with vaginal mucus? If the overly shock factor doesn't stop you from reading, the redundancy might, and the details can just get overly gross with little to no reason. But for me personally, I just hated how one-sided it all felt. Garth Ennis and Butcher might as well be the same person, because at times he really acts like the center mouthpiece that can't offer any perspective aside from his own. Somehow he manifested his own personal playground where you can play with his toys, but only by his rules. At first, I thought the fact that he had total creative freedom was awesome. What artist wouldn't want to create their vision in its purest form? But after getting through the end, I was left thinking that maybe someone should have hovered over his shoulder with a few changes or ideas. Hell, the only thing I would have asked for is something to balance out his narrow-minded viewpoints. A strong opposing force to bounce off his morbid ideals and bring the presented message to life. At least then, the story would have given me more to think about than that garbage-ass ending. Sorry, got a little ahead of myself there. I don't count MM or Mallory because while they do acknowledge Butcher's descent into chaos, they don't really do anything about it either. If someone goes against Butcher, he'll win every time. Whatever results he expects, he'll eventually get just because. And because of this, his psychotic points and way of life also win out. And that's just boring. Which is why I love the show's execution, among so many other things. You look at its source and wonder how anyone could bring this to life, but Amazon managed with the power of collaboration and careful restructuring of the narrative that surprisingly still honors the source material. Going back through this season with context, it amazed me that the characters were not completely rewritten. Remnants of their bad habits and faulty history from the comics were still there, heavily hinted at existing during phases of their past, and instead of treating them as just nods to the source material, the show takes it one step further and explores those issues through incredible depth and character growth. The derogatory origins of the comics weren't buried, but instead fueled the retelling of this narrative by picking apart its problematic nature and showing how it wouldn't fare with our modern day social norms. You know those movies where fictional characters brought into our world and go through some extreme change in their perspective and begin to see life in a different lens? That's essentially what I think about the show's approach to adapting the comics. Not all, of course, but mainly the superheroes that were brought to life with their stereotypical roles and archetypes as the overarching challenge they need to overcome. The fish guy who's tired of feeling like a joke and is thrown into a soul-searching journey. The superwoman who, after years of being sold as a fierce, dominating sex icon, could pursue a life away from the misogyny. And the leading hero who's slowly losing interest in living up to that perfect image everyone expects of him. And it's not like these ideas weren't present in the comics, because they were, but the show knew how to make a conversation out of them. It's no longer just the one-sided ramblings of a single man, but a collaborative project that built upon this intriguing concept with amazing direction, well-rounded characters, and the right amount of chaos to bring you back for more. By comparison, the show is almost perfect in every way possible. But even saying that, I would still encourage people to check out the source material. I am neither trying nor expecting to change anyone's mind with this review. No matter what I say, I know it won't have much effect on people who have already solidified their opinions with the series. I'm mainly speaking as a genuine fan at this point, reaching out to the ones who also love the show and had wonders about its source. If the show touched you in a way like it did me, the comics might be worth checking out. The two are so vastly different, they're practically not even the same story. For better or worse, you'll be guaranteed a completely new experience. But just be warned that it won't be easy. Let your curiosity guide you towards an unexpected surprise. Might be a good surprise or a bad surprise, but a surprise nonetheless. And if it's not your cup of tea, that's alright, because the show is right there too, purifying all the toxicity to leave you with the good stuff. Underneath all the grime and gore, there's a decently good story here. And I'm just thankful that we got two different ways for everyone to enjoy it. And on that note, those are my final thoughts on season 1 of The Boys. And as always, it's just one fan's opinion. So, what'd you guys think of the comics and or Amazon series? Be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and comment down below if you want me to continue with this. I don't know if it was obvious, but I had such an enormous blast making this, and I would have no problem continuing on with the next 2 to 3 seasons. But that all depends on how much y'all love this one. So if you're really interested in seeing me talk more about The Boys, like this video and be vocal in the comments down below. Anyways, with that said, I guess I'll see y'all in the next review. Take care, guys.